Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is my continuing class on the Hieroglyphic Monad, or Monas Hieroglyphica of Dr. John D. We're up to Theorem 18 now, using the translation that Dr. Nancy Turner and I did a couple years ago that's out from Ouroboros Press. And what I want to do in this, for this theorem is I'm going to give you a problem to solve, as I've done in some earlier videos. But in this video, I'll just ask you to pause at a certain point if you want to solve it on your own. If you want more hints, you can keep playing, and I'll give you the solution at the end of this particular video. So we're at Theorem 18. You have two really interesting diagrams, one of an egg and one of a spiral. What we're going to do in this one is just look at the first part, this riddle of the egg, then I'll give you hints to figure it out on your own, and then I'll give you my two solutions. So of course, I'm assuming you know who John D is. I'm assuming you know what the Monas Hieroglyphica is. I'm assuming that you understand it through Theorem 17. In 16, he gave you his LVX, sign of the cross, as a central, a governing symbol, if you will. In 17, he related 252 and the Hebrew alphabet to the philosopher's stone, making you a Kabbalistic Tyrian. So hopefully you understand what I just said there. If not, the whole playlist is below. In fact, I've divided it into 4 playlists. There's one on the whole class. There's one that is, well, actually, I've got 5 of them. There's one that's the whole class. There's one that is just the theorems, one that's just the letters, one that is wordplay, and one that is other supporting texts. So there's plenty of material there. Let's go ahead and jump into Theorem 18. Theorem 18, he says, from our 12th and 13th theorems, we can concentrate into a whole the concept that celestial astronomy serves as a parent and teacher to inferior astronomy. Now, you remember back in Theorems 12 and 13, you had some homework to figure that out, because his meaning of inferior astronomy was not the usual meaning used then or now by astronomers. It has nothing to do with epicycles and that sort of thing. It also has little to do with a usage made by some physical alchemists, and I use the example of George Ripley, had a whole separate video looking at Ripley's wheel as an idea of inferior astronomy. It has nothing to do with that except as metaphor. You can use it as a metaphor all you want. It works as a great metaphor. Now, if you look at these two diagrams, and you have studied them already, you might have found that the spiral seems the easiest one to figure out if you remember Theorems 12 and 13. That is, he was going through those rotations of either 3 or 4 world ages. It seems he's only interested in 3, but he says it's compatible with an understanding of a 4th age. All right, so the first rotation, if you remember, the golden age was Saturn or Kronos, then Zeus or Jupiter, then the moon, then one of his Mercury symbols. Although in those theorems, he gives you 4 different Mercury symbols, not counting the big 5th one, which is his monad glyph as a Mercury symbol. So since he tends to go from 3s and 4s to the quintessence 5, he's also making Mercury, philosophic Mercury, the quintessence. Okay. And of course, you need to remember, and how can you forget, how D has made 252 under the philosopher's stone. First, he has gone through all these puns with the Kabbalistic Tyrian, a person who is pursuing the philosopher's stone by studying the Kabbalah. Then he's multiplying 3 times 7 times 12 to get 252, and he's doing that because 3 mother letters, 7 double letters, 12 singles in the Hebrew alphabet. So he's making that the Hebrew alphabet, in effect, the entire represented powers of creation, which is what it would be to a Kabbalist. Okay, so let's see what he does in the opening paragraph here. D says, from our 12th and 13th theorems, we can concentrate into a whole the concept that celestial astronomy serves as the parent and teacher to inferior astronomy. Having raised our Kabbalistic eyes that have been illuminated by the foregoing speculation on these mysteries to the heavens, we gaze attentively upon an anatomy of our monad. Okay, let's pause. Our Kabbalistic eyes. So if you're going to raise your Kabbalistic eyes from Malkuth, the earth you're on, you're raising it up the middle pillar to Tifereth. And indeed, it might seem that that's what you're doing here, except things seem a little out of order, or do they? Okay. And remember Tifereth, now that he has made LVX in the light of the cross his central symbol, you can associate all of those LVX things to Tifereth along with the associations you already had, like gold, sun, S-O-N or S-U-N, the letter X, or the Greek letter Chi, the Christos, light of the cross, luminous cones. He's had all kinds of fun with that. All right. Then when he says an anatomy of the monad, he's explicitly that referring back to the 12th and 13th theorems, the way that he took it apart and said the signs of the planets are made up of parts of the monad, and he rediscovers signs of the planets. Some are made of the sun, some of the moon, some of the cross of elements, some of the symbol of Aries at the bottom. Why they're associated with the planets is important because, among other things, recall the role that the planets play in the Timaeus, and recall that the planets and the zodiac are all associated with the tree of life. All right. So the anatomy of the monad, his symbol of everything. And so then he says, which in the light, LVX, of nature, recall the multiple meanings here of nature. Now you're going back to Theorem 15, right? Nature rejoices in nature, or nature begets nature. And of course, LVX, the light of the cross, as the crux of the matter, where crux in Latin means exactly the same as cross. And it's also where we get words like crucified and crucible and so on. Okay, the light of nature and life itself is perpetually displayed here before us at its will. He puts will in all caps. Why does he do that? Well, remember back to our discussion of Vo Archidamus, which is a play upon Pantio or Pantheus's Vo Archidumia. He's very taken, and he has all kinds of marginalia in his copy of the Vo Archidumia with the gematria of God's will. And in God's will, the word will, using the Latin word nutu, comes up to 72. 72 is important for a couple of reasons. Most obviously, it's the number of the Shemhem Foresh, which you by now know what is, and also because of precessional astronomy and moving fixed stars moving 1 degree, and you know by now what precessional astronomy is too. Okay, so at its will, in this most secret analysis of the physics of this mystery, the aperture becomes most open to view. This secret analysis of the physics of this mystery is the riddle we're trying to solve, because he says it's a secret, but he's figuring with all these mnemonics that he has used and the text that he assumes you know, you're going to be able to figure it out here. So that's what I want you to do. Try to figure this out. So we can look at it as at least 2 secrets, and we might think about what are some things that he may not want to say explicitly. There are a couple of them. Let's see if I can get my screen to go here. We'll have to look at the end of this sentence first, where he says, at its will in this most secret analysis of the physics of this mystery, the aperture becomes most open to view. Most of us think of an aperture with a camera, and indeed, it's possible that Dee knew about a camera obscura. You can look that up if you're interested. Some people have argued that he did, but the word doesn't have to refer to camera, though it's used a lot in optics. And of course, he's very interested in optics and luminous cones, as we've discussed with the Propoitomata aphoristica. So an aperture, though, is just an opening, such as a hole, a gap, or a slit, usually something that lets light in. So we've already seen that, if you're following my cursor, with this little circle and dot, right? Now, for Pythagoreans, that's a symbol of the whole monad. For most people, and for Dee in this work, it's also a symbol of the sun. It's a symbol commonly used still by astronomers and astrologers for the sun. And this little dot would seem to be an aperture. In those early theorems, it was the point either through which, or at the same time which, the receptacle takes the images of the world of being and manifests the world of becoming that's always in motion, or it is where the upper 3 Sephiroth through the shaping of Bina then manifests through Dot, the middle pillar of the tree, which then quickly polarizes as the earth falls in Kabbalistic thought. So this looks like an aperture. Notice over here, these planetary glyphs that are made of the sun symbol, and which in effect are the yolk of the egg here, don't have the aperture. So since if you think of Dee's world ages, he was only really interested in the creation, first 10 theorems, and you flip the monad, then the middle pillar forms, but as soon as it polarizes, you have the fall. And now he's interested in the restoring of that world and is interested basically in revelation. Okay, so what we're looking at here, since the aperture is open and the world has fallen, is perhaps opening the aperture to that light of Tifereth through your Kabbalistic eyes that have been illuminated by the foregoing speculation on the mysteries. Just to add to that, the egg itself, it's a frequent symbol in alchemy, and he is using alchemy as a huge metaphor here. It's often associated with the Ouroboros serpent. It's a literal symbol of how nature begets nature, or the parts of an egg are also associated with alchemical processes. He's going to do that in the very next paragraph, in fact. And he'll also discuss orbits in the shape of an egg. On top of this, in Latin, this isn't even speculation. It's just what words mean, because the Latin word for oval means egg-shaped. So it's not a metaphor for egg-shaped. It's the same word. Oval is egg-shaped. If we think of the heavenly messenger that he is talking about at the end of this paragraph, he means Mercury. So let's read that. But here we are instructed to apply the figure of an egg to give it coordination, even though we have beheld this heavenly messenger throughout our theorems and been thoroughly instructed in this celestial sign. There is a whole stylized glyph of Mercury, but here you see one of his other glyphs. And notice it looks like one where like hands are looking up to the heaven as if receiving some kind of light. We've had all kinds of other puns on Mercury, Stillbone, Hermes, talked about this as a Hermetic text. Now, let's just talk about the planet. The fact that Mercury's orbit is what would now be called eccentric, meaning more elliptical than the others, less circular, more elliptical, or more oval, that was known in Dee's time. Okay, that you can figure that out, and it's that way whether you have a geocentric or heliocentric view, or if you have both. Okay. Oh, here's a picture of an Ouroboros serpent that would have been in one of Dee's books, since although he didn't list it in his library catalog, he did have a copy of the Codex Marcianus. He left it in with a ruler in Germany when he and Kelly were leaving and parting ways after their continental adventure, which is a couple decades in the future from this. Here's a more typical picture of the Ouroboros serpent. I just thought you might enjoy some eye candy before we jump into your solving of the riddle. This is a copy someone made in 1478 of a lost 7th century track, just by the way. All right, back to Theorem 18, the riddle of the egg. What you want to solve is this most secret analysis of the physics of this mystery. What could he mean by this? And the hints that will help you is think about what he can't say explicitly. Yeah, he said Kabbalah, Kabbalah, Kabbalah over and over again. He hasn't ever said, though, for example, that in the Sefer Yetzirah, the 22 Hebrew letters create the world. And I don't think, just my interpretation, that this is Dee being coy. I think it's not safe. Remember the generation before, Reuchlin suffered some fairly severe consequences from being a Christian Kabbalist. One of his sources, Riccio, who was a Jewish converso, converted to Christianity because it wasn't safe to be a Jew in that time period. 1492 is when the Jews and Muslims both were kicked out of Spain, which is the seat of some of the most important work in Kabbalah. And Riccio is translating Gikatia, who is a student of the famous Spanish Kabbalist Abraham Abulafia. And if you put that lineage together, you understand the things we've talked about here. But that is very different from D being able to say those things. Okay. Now there's one other thing that has to do with the orbits of planets that D can't say here. So if you want to solve this on your own, pause the video now and just try to do that. I've given you all the tools you need to solve this, and you'll remember it better. I mean, solving things on your own literally creates new neural pathways. This is, after all, a mnemonic device more than anything else for how well you can kind of play across all these different frames of reference. So if you want to solve this on your own, pause here. You've got the text in front of you, and go ahead and try to solve it. Just keep the words here on your screen. You may know already, it may take you an hour, it may take you a day, but you have all the tools you need to solve this riddle. Meanwhile, I will continue on. For those of you who don't want to solve it yourself, I'm still going to push you, because at a certain point, what I hope is this just dawns on you. For example, here's another hint. Gee, these are all in a row, kind of like the middle pillar that you travel up from Malkuth. Is that going to be significant? Well, let me remind you of a few things from Theorem 12 and 13 as you try to solve this. In Theorem 12, he gave you these two drawings. He said the most ancient wise ones have passed down hieroglyphic signs of the 5 planets. He has 5 instead of 7 because he's using 2 of them to make up the shapes of all the other, the sun, the moon. He's also using the cross of the elements. He's also using Aries. And you recall that what he's doing with these glyphs of the planets is a kind of parallel action to what Kabbalists do. That is, Kabbalists believe that they're using the language of Mosaic law given by God to Moses, but that language has degenerated a little bit over time, so they're trying to fix it. How do you do that? Through meditation, through revelation? I mean, you're wanting God to talk to you, basically. Those of you that know Dee's later Enochian works know how extreme he gets with this. At a certain point, a couple decades later, he becomes interested in the first Adamic language, the one that God supposedly spoke to Enoch. So this remains an obsession of his, okay? So what he's doing is trying to find the true forms of the planets, not just as kind of a trick, but as an act of revelation. Christian Kabbalists who appropriate the tradition of Kabbalah haven't, with the exception of D, as far as I know, done this with planetary symbols and all other symbols, but they do appropriate the tradition to see it as prefiguring the return of Christ and or the rising up the tree. Remember, in Greek, Christ would be Christos, which just it means the anointed one. So as a way of anointing themselves. Then he goes in Theorem 12 still into this thing of the rotation of world ages. So remember what he was doing there. He wasn't doing what Joachim of Fiore was doing exactly, though it seemed like it, but he wasn't predicting an age of the second coming. Joachim did that and the date passed and people were less impressed. But he is doing something that you find in, for example, in Greek, the work of Hesiod, or in Ovid in Latin. Great world ages like a golden age, a silver age, a lead age, a bronze age, sort of, but not exactly. So Jupiter, pardon me, Saturn, what I'm circling here, associated with Kronos, he equates with the Garden of Eden before the fall. There is no time. Everything is wonderful. If people age, they age backwards. Then Zeus or Jupiter comes in and overthrows Saturn or Kronos. You get the Silver Age. Now, there are some confusions about this, lots of them, in fact, because we would associate Saturn with lead, not gold. So there you have that lead gold thing again. And by the time you get to the moon, you're maybe assuming that this is just the concept of this third age where the world is healed and resurrected, because the moon is associated with Yesod, the treasure house of images. And then the fourth age, which he says it's not incompatible with, would be either the second coming, or it is you in this fifth quintessence one with fire under at the bottom here, firing yourself back up the middle pillar of the tree as a Kabbalistic Tyrian. You can make all sorts of other associations with elements, and like I said, problematically for metals, because with Saturn you get both lead and gold. And the fifth, or the quintessence, might be the same thing as squaring the circle in physical alchemy. Now, if you don't solve the blinds up to 12, which, since you're in this class with me, you have, because I've solved them for you, and maybe you've solved them your own in your homework, by the time you get to 13, it seems even more like physical alchemy and less like Kabbalah, because in Theorem 13, he says, with this diagram, that he's giving you the original monadic anatomy of the entire realm of inferior astronomy. And we go through and correlated these to the rotations, right? So here's Saturn, that was the first rotation. Jupiter is the second. There's the moon that is the third. There's one of his Mercury glyphs, which is the fourth, and so on. And your homework was to explain why he was mapping them out like this. And so we talk more about inferior astronomy, and that it had nothing to do with epicycles, that it had to do with uses of the use of alchemists like George Ripley. I showed you in a separate video on Ripley's wheel how Ripley used this, referred you to some wonderful scholarship of Rampling. So what you have in that kind of squaring the wheel of physical alchemy is fascinating, but I would submit to you, it's not going to help solve the riddle of the egg in this theorem. So when I ask you to solve this Kabbalistically and take each graphic and refer it to one of the Sephiron using either the manifest or unmanifest tree of life, that is either before the fall or after, and then we went over that, because what you were doing was showing how after the fall, the tree is recreated or resurrected. It's a Christian or Hermetic analog to what becomes called Tikkun Olam in Kabbalistic thought, the healing of the world after the thought, which in Reuchlin's Art of Kabbalah, he has Simon the Jew say that's the purpose of Kabbalah. Okay, so you had a blank tree of life. You did the first rotation, which is when Mercury or Stillbone pierces through at dot and manifests the middle pillar, except this tree, this sphere down here, Malkuth, is a different color because it's before the fall. Then you have the lightning flash order of creation after the sides polarize. That they polarize at the fall. And what you have there is absolutely identical to the lightning flash order used by contemporary Hermetic Kabbalists today. So you remember all that, right? Because that's all important for what becomes, if you know where to look, a simple solution to this riddle of the egg. Okay, and we went through and talked about the usual order of planets, and what we realize is that Bina, although it's the third Sephira, would be, it's his one because it's the golden age. That is, the middle pillar manifests after you have Kether, limitless light, then you have, or the prima mobile, sorry, then you have the zodiac, then you have Saturn manifesting through dot, the middle pillar. This is so similar to some of the things you get in a very different way in the Timaeus that some writers have assumed that there had to be a Greek Kabbalah, and or the Kabbalists had to either know the Greek Kabbalah, know the Timaeus, or both. Okay. So after you assigned all of those planets to the Sephiroth, you got something like this. And you took this symbol, the Aries symbol at the bottom, because there you are. This is Malkuth. Usually you get an X symbol there. That's what he uses elsewhere across of the elements for Earth, even in his own personal diary or of manifestation. But you have this Mercury glyph that looks like you've raised your Kabbalistic eyes up to Tifereth. And we remember all the things that become associated with Tifereth, the Zaire Anpin, the microprosopis, which will then refer to the 6 Sephiroth around it if you count in Dot as the non-Sephirah, as a Sephirah. Sometimes it's called the lesser countenance. If you have studied Kabbalah, which you probably have, if for no reason else you're trying to keep up in this course, you can do a lot with all of those things. So that is why he's associating the center of this, his entire monad, his master Mercury glyph, with Tifereth. And that makes sense, right? Because he's also associated the light of the cross with Tifereth. And you have seen how he overlays Mercury on the tree of life. Now you have these rotations again, but let's look at this in terms of the egg. So we have this as an open aperture. We've just opened this up as an aperture, but we know that when this is open, it is going to be referring to all 6 Sephiroth around it, including Doth, and Tifereth is the 7th. So let's see what we have here. We have this person in Malkuth gazing upward. They have here apparently traveled up to Yesod, traveling being a metaphor, obviously. And yes, there are smaller trees within larger trees. So maybe we're just talking about traveling up this in Malkuth. You can bring in any and all Kabbalistic interpretations and see how they work here. But so if we certainly are metaphorically above Yesod, because we have all these images, and Yesod is the treasure house of images. So we are opening our eyes to Tifereth, the aperture of which is open. Now look over here, and I think you, while I am talking, have solved the first one of these. Because what do we have here if we now let Mercury, this Mercury, be Mercury? Well, we are open from Malkuth to the lightning flash order of the tree. That's what this is, right? There is Yesod, there is Hod. These are both Mercuries, right? Here is Venus. Venus is part of the yoke. There is Tifereth, the center part of the yoke. There is Mars over here. And now outside, we are over here to Geburah. I'm sorry, Kesed. That was Geburah. And now we are back to Bina. He's basically given you the lightning flash order in a straight line, because perhaps you're just supposed to perceive these others, but you're going straight up the tree. Okay, so now I think you can solve the riddle of the egg, at least the first riddle. In fact, I've just solved it for you. What you have here is the egg as this lightning flash order that you are perceiving as you open your Kabbalistic eyes to Tifereth. Now, I think that's pretty cool. If we want to look at another meaning here, well, you can pause again and think about this not in terms of Kabbalah, but think of simply the planets. Now, for what he's doing overall in the monad in the next several theorems, this isn't what I'm about to say that important. What it is terribly important in terms of the history of science. So let's take a look at this second one. For it is widely known by astronomers that he, Mercury, in his course through the ethers, orbits in the shape of an egg. It's an oval orbit. Do you know that? We know that. And That, once said, should be enough for the wise. It agrees entirely with everything previously stated in our interpretation of this celestial council, presented here hieroglyphically. And then he's going to whip on alchemists a little bit. All right, we'll talk about that a little more in the next video, but remember, Pantheo came up with another whole term, archemy, for alchemists who were basically not trying to get rich, but were studying this for spiritual reasons. So you can, for now, just understand it that way. I mean, that's how you will understand it. It's just in the next video, we'll talk about some of these other terms. So, solution to the riddle. We've talked about the first. The planetary symbols are in lightning flash order. The aperture that opens is the light of the cross at Tiferet. But what is something else that Dee definitely can't put in writing? Pause here if you need to, because I'm about to tell you. These planets are rotating around the sun. Now, we see them rotating this way rather than in a circle. But if we want to look at this as some evidence that Dee knows heliocentrism, I would say it's impossible that he didn't. In fact, he was thrown in the tower with a Copernican being, someone who subscribes to the heliocentric notion of the universe, that all of our planets rotate around the sun. So he's having planets that are associated with Sephiroth around Tiferet, but it's still important that you know they're around the sun, and he's talking about orbits. So also, when this aperture is open, it's affecting the Earth, Malkuth. So you seem to be getting a concept here that from Tiferet, everything revolves around the sun. Well, Kabbalistically, that's true, first of all. And remember that the kind of things that people have said, even very good scholars, when they insist he has a geocentric view of the universe, is making assumptions that things in Dee's universe don't transform. And as I've said, if you're an astrologer or astronomer, and in Dee's time they're the same thing, of course, your view is geocentric. You're on the Earth. You're looking at, in the Propoitomata Aphoristica, how luminous cones exert force on Earth. You're telling people how to navigate by the stars and planets on Earth. The same thing is true if you're a physical alchemist. Now, the physical alchemists actually were, Ripley is before Copernicus. They probably did have a geocentric view, but they're not talking about rotation of planets around the Earth. What they're talking about is celestial analogs of things on Earth. They're not interested in the whole concept of what planets rotate around in the same way that we might be interested in I don't know, a middle school science course. Okay, so that's a second possible meaning. Not going to be helpful in solving the rest of the monad, but I think it is there. Most importantly, what he is describing as a solution to this riddle is your personal path up the tree of life, how you, in effect, resurrect yourself, how you become the Christos. Also notice that the solar objects, as he defined them in Theorem XII, become the yoke. All right. Now, he will be using in the rest of this paragraph the language of physical alchemy as a metaphor for spiritual alchemy. So when he continues on, he says, may those most inexperienced impostors in their desperation here come to know what the water of the albumen of the egg is, out of what does the oil of the yolk emerge, what the chalk of the egg is, and of many other similar things. We'll define that in the beginning of our next video. But he says here we have well nigh the total proportions of nature. By the time you get to Theorem 23, he's going to have a whole graph where he tells you what he thinks those proportions are. All right, so once you know to do the LVX sign backwards and what all of his references have meant in Theorem 16 and 17, you can then go back to 12 and 13 and solve the riddle of the egg. So we're going to move on to the next part of this. What do we have waiting for you here? Well, we'll have an Aesop's fable about a scarab or dung beetle that keeps destroying the eggs of an eagle, even one deposited in Jupiter or Zeus's lap. And by then, of course, you will be listening to that with the knowledge that Jupiter or Zeus was the one who ended the golden age by overthrowing Saturn or Kronos. That's where we're going to go in our next video. I probably won't have that out for 3 or 4 more days at least, but I will see you then. Have a great day. Bye-bye.